Thank you all very, very much for being here with us today. I'm Shihoko Goto, the Northeast Asia Associate for the Asia program here at the Wilson Center. We are actually being webcast live, and for those of you who have never been to the Wilson Center was established in 1968 as a living memorial to the 28th President Woodrow Wilson. We actually are partially funded by Congress, and as a result, we are nonpartisan, and we are certainly bipartisan. We are here today to talk about East Asia, and it has actually been almost 20 years since the World Bank released its very revolutionary study called the East Asian Miracle. At that time, the work highlighted how the so-called Asian tigers, through impressive education systems, ethic of productivity, regulatory reform, investment practices, have led to a surge in growth in an area that had been devastated over the last by war and other calamities. Asia today still remains an economic force, and indeed, as the world economy faces a lot of pressure, Asia is seen as one of the hottest spots, if not the only hot spot in the world at the moment that can actually move the global economy forward. But at the same time, the risks in the region are very evident. We are talking about China. Is it facing a soft landing or a hard landing? Japan, will it ever get out of its 2 decades of economic doldrums? What are the industries in East Asia that can actually lead to growth from here on out? For Taiwan, that has actually been in the technology sector, especially in the semiconductor industry. Is that momentum going to continue? Are the regulatory reforms that have been in place that have worked in the past going to continue to work? I hope that these are some of the issues that we can discuss today. With me are 3 very wonderful speakers. To my left is Alejandro Espinosa-Wang. He is in the private sector development team of the World Bank, and he's actually part of the team that produces its annual Doing Business publication, which I've been informed is the second most widely read World Bank publication. The Doing Business report for this year ranks Taiwan in 16th place out of 185. I hope that he can talk a little bit more about why that is and what it can do to beat Singapore, which is #1 this year. To his left is Rupert Hammond-Chambers. He is the head of the U.S.-Taiwan Business Council, and he's probably one of the most knowledgeable people on Taiwan-U.S. relations here in this town. And to his left is Professor Peter Chow of the City College of New York. And I'm hoping that he will be able to give us a broad overview of not just only of what has worked for Taiwan and many East Asian countries to date, but also what, if any, legislative reform can go ahead moving forward to continue that success. So with that, Alejandro?
Thank you. So I have a presentation. I hope to be brief. I don't know if we can. Okay, thank you. So first of all, thank you for having me. I'm very glad to be here with all of you. So as Shikoko mentioned, I will talk about doing business in Taiwan from the perspective of the Doing Business report, which is I would say, very relevant perspective, but also very limited, and I will let you know what I mean. So for those of you who doesn't know what the Doing Business publication is, it's a publication from the World Bank and the IFC, which is the International Financial Corporation, the private sector branch of the World Bank Group, and it's produced annually. This year is our 10th publication, actually, so we are getting there, but we're still a very young publication. We try to focus on the regulations relevant to small and medium-sized companies in a country, so we're not measuring foreign direct investment or regulations for foreign investors. To be able to compare them, we build case studies very standardized, so we can ask the same questions basically in all the countries to be able to benchmark them. To make it comparable and to make it easy for us, because we measure in 185 economies around the world, we try to put in the shoes of an entrepreneur in the biggest city in that particular economy. So for the case of Taiwan, we use Taipei, and for the case of the U.S., for example, we use New York. And we only focus on the formal sector to give these questions. And again, it's very important to remember that we do not measure everything. For example, we don't measure macroeconomic stability, corruption, or labor skills, which we know are very relevant information, but that's why I said it was a very limited perspective. So we try to portray like smart regulations, how regulations affect the business cycle of small entrepreneurs. So we think regulation should be streamlined, meaningful, adaptable, relevant, and transparent. We have 11 indicators to measure the regulation. So in the first group of indicators, we call it like complexity and cost of regulatory processes. So we measure how to start a business, for example, or how to connect to electricity. So basically we ask an entrepreneur, okay, there's a case study. If we want to open this kind of business, how long it will take, where do you have to go, how many procedures, the cost and the time. And then we compare it across the world. And we also have the strength of legal institutions, second set of indicators, where we have indicators like protecting investors to see minority shareholders, their rights within a company, or how to enforce contracts in a country. And we also measure them and compare them. We have an employing workers indicator, which is, we collect the data and we have the data, but it's not part of the overall ranking used by the Doing Business report. So why would we do this? So there's some research that shows that informality is associated levels with Doing Business rankings, meaning that when regulations are clearer and they are streamlined and they are adaptable, as I mentioned before, and transparent, there's a correlation where the economies will tend to be more formal. So people will respect the rules, basically. If rules are very complex and are very hard to apply them, people will tend to go to the informal sector. So this is why we think having smart regulations can diminish the levels of informality. Also, even if we don't measure foreign direct investment directly, we also saw in this year's report, we have a case study that I will invite all of you to visit our website and look at the case study, that there's a correlation between FDI and Doing Business rankings. And basically FDI in per capita terms, because there's some big countries, you will see that in the ranking, some of the big economies are not doing that well, and then people ask why, and then if you see their per capita numbers of FDI, they're not as impressive if you count as the whole of the country. So we see that if you have good regulations for small and medium-sized companies that are local, usually this translates in better regulations for foreign investors too. In this year's top 30 economies as measured by Doing Business, you will see, as Shikoko mentioned, that Singapore is heading the world ranking. But you see that within the top 30, a lot of them are from the region. So again, Taiwan is 16. So Taiwan, for the first time in the 10 years we're measuring the report, made it to the top 20. So this is a big improvement from Taiwan. And we have other economies like Korea, Japan, and Malaysia within this group. And how the region compares to others. So you can see that, for example, the average of the OECD region is 29, and the average of East Asia Pacific is 86. But here, bear in mind that we have to use the World Bank grouping of countries, and within East Asia of the Pacific, there's a huge variance. We'll see in the next slide, because we include countries like Singapore, for example, and small islands in the Pacific. So you'll see it's a big variance in the ranking, and that's why the average it seems like a little behind other regions like Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So here you can see in the top, you see countries like Singapore, economies like Hong Kong, or economies like Taiwan being very in the top, but then you have Timor-Leste and Laos in the bottom. But you can see that Taiwan is clearly in the top group on the region. And how did Taiwan get to this point? So as I mentioned, we have the 11 indicators. We have 10 here because the employing workers is not part of the ranking. And you can see that Taiwan ranks higher than the average of the region in almost all the indicators except for enforcing contracts. So, but basically Taiwan is doing very well, but has room to improve even more, but it overall is doing well in our rankings. This is just a quick overview of the rankings and the world's top ranked and the top in the region. So you can see that, for example, starting a business, the easiest place to start a business is New Zealand, according to a report, and then Singapore comes in fourth in the region. And then, for example, getting credit, which is crediting for bureau's information or legal rights for secured lenders. Malaysia, it's in the top in the world too, and in other areas like trade and cross-border, Singapore is in the top, and in resolving insolvency, we have Japan, Singapore number 2, and Taiwan it's in the 15 spot. And in this slide is very interesting because here we try to compare, as I mentioned at the beginning, the strength of legal regulations and the complexity and cost of the regulations. So the size of the bubble is the size of the country population. So that's why you see China there. But you see that China, even if it has relatively strong legal institutions, it has kind of a complex regulatory process. But then you see the group of economies like Malaysia, Thailand, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, where they have both like very less expensive regulatory process and at the same time stronger legal institutions. And other countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, or Laos, which are lagging behind in these two indicators. This is just the number of, because this is a yearly publication, so we track the numbers of reforms every year. And we see how East Asia and the Pacific, almost half of the economies that we measured, did something to improve the regulatory environment last year. Again, when you take the region's numbers, you have to take into account that the variance within the region is very big. But we see that clearly regions like Eastern Europe and Central Asia have been reforming not only this year, but in the past years very aggressively. And you can see that 88% of them made at least a positive reform as we measured them last year. We also tried to portray the 10 economies around the world that have improved the most from one year to the other. We see that the only one from the East Asia and the Pacific region was Mongolia, but then we see that Poland was, for example, the country that improved the most from one year to another. And here's also to make clear that, for example, countries like economies like Taiwan it's hard for them to make it to the top 10 because they're already doing very well. So this is more for the economies that are lagging behind and maybe they do a big improvement to show they have improved the most compared to others. And this year, we see that Taiwan, for example, these are all the reforms in the region by indicator. So we see that Taiwan this year made 2 reforms, one in the construction permits area, we'll look into more detail later, and also in the protecting investors area. Those are the 2 reforms that Taiwan made this year. And here there are a little more detail. For example, in the construction sector, Taiwan, and here we're talking about Taipei, implemented a one-stop shop for construction permits, make it a much easier process to obtain a building permit. This has been a process that's been taking 3 years, and we can see that, for example, 14 procedures to obtain a building permit in Taipei were eliminated last year, or streamlined, better word. And we also see they protected investors, again, for local investors or local shareholders. They have improved because disclosure requirements for related party transactions and liability regimes have improved within the country. We also have another measure that is new this year. We're trying to track the progress of the economies for since 2005. So again, as I mentioned earlier, the top 10 that we had only highlights the economies that maybe were not doing that well and did something and moved in the ranking. This measure, we tried to see for the last 5 years how much they have improved compared to the best that we have in the ranking. So you see that, for example, in the region, China was the country that, even if it's behind the Taiwan in the overall ranking today, it has improved a lot in the last years. And Taiwan is also in that group. You see, is in the top 50 economies that have improved the most since we started measuring doing business. We call it closer to the frontier, to getting to the top or the best practices that we see around the world. So this is why a country like Singapore won't be here, because they started very well. So it's not that they're lagging behind; it's just they're already in a good spot. So they haven't been in the group of economies improving. And this is just the same data, just more graphically. So you see, Singapore is closer to the frontier, which is the top of in every indicator, and it has maintained that level very high. And then you see economies like Taiwan. It was, if you see in 2005, it was further away from that frontier, has a bigger distance, and then in the last years it had improved, and it's getting closer. And this shows that since 2005, Taiwan have made important improvements in regulations to get closer to this frontier. And other economies like also China, you see that they started in 2005 in a very low position, and they have been moving very fast. This is another way of seeing how they're moving, and you see how Taiwan moved up a little since 2005 when talking about the regulations. So thank you very much. I hope it was useful. It was just an overview of how Taiwan and some other economies in the region are doing the Doing Business report. I invite you to visit our website, and you can find all the information, all the rankings, and all the details of each of the rankings in our website. Thank you very much.
Rupert?
Well, I'd like to start by thanking Shihoko and the Wilson Center for hosting this important event and for inviting me to speak at it. So I'm grateful for both. I'd like to start on a somber note. Somebody very important in US-Taiwan relations, actually two people, but I'll touch on both. But firstly, passed just recently, one was Nancy Berkov-Tucker, who has a strong long-term relationship with the Wilson Center. She was a friend to many of you too, better than me. I knew Nancy professionally and had lots of opportunities to spend time with her over the years. And the other person who I wish to mention at the beginning of this is Jeffrey Gu. Jeffrey founded the China Trust Bank with Gu Jianfu, his uncle, and had a long time impact on Taiwan's economy and also on US-Taiwan relations. In the latter capacity as the head of numerous organizations that promoted trade and relations between the US and Taiwan. It's very difficult to really appropriately characterize just what a huge impact leaders like Gu Jianfu and Jeffrey Gu, Stan Shert, Asa, Morris Jung, and others had on US-Taiwan relations, but it's very significant. And in some instances still ongoing, as somebody like Morris Jung continues to head up Taiwan Semiconductor. But through their leadership in organizations, their willingness to invest their own resources in these organizations, in travel, in sponsoring cooperation, they played a material role in Taiwan's rise since the end of the Second World War. And Jeffrey's death is not only tragic in its own right, he was a remarkable and wonderful man, but it also heralds, I think, or begs the question, who's going to step in? Who will replace the Jeffrey Gus as his generation, as his generation retires and dies? Which business leaders within Taiwan are going to fill that void? Not as entrepreneurs and builders of businesses. We can see that continuing. Taiwan is an incredibly dynamic and entrepreneurial environment, but where industry and organizations and associations combine together to allow Taiwan to bat above its weight when it has to deal with such strong political headwinds as a consequence of Chinese opposition to almost any attempt by Taiwan to represent its equities in a fair and meaningful way. So we will miss both of them greatly, and I did just want to start with that. I'm going to talk a wee bit about the tech industry and its significance and importance to Taiwan's evolution, to its relationship with the United States, and then touch a wee bit on where I think it's going and why I think it's essential for Taiwan's future that it continue to that it continue to nurture its tech industry, that it continue to grow it, both in the areas that it's in already, and also that it continues to seek new sectors within the supply chain, not just as a manufacturer of hardware, but as a developer of its own intellectual property, an area that it has not done a good enough job in to date and needs to do a much better job if it's going to compete with the South Koreans principally, frankly, but not exclusively. So a wee bit of history. We have this, if we go back to the early 90s, the late 80s, the opening up to China and the burgeoning supply chain between the US and Taiwan, where Taiwan companies were increasingly manufacturing the things that we were procuring here. Low-tech calculators. I don't know if you guys remember the Simons. That was a game that you pushed, the colors would appear and you'd push them, and they were quite simple toys, but because of the supply chain, you had these machines, these electronic machines coming out, the 70s and 80s. Japanese originally would identify them, but Taiwan really took that over, and you saw them start to walk up the supply chain and the value chain with these basic electronic products through the 90s. And as that was taking place, even though Taiwan has had and retains many significant barriers to cross-strait trade, that hasn't stopped Taiwanese businesses from investing massively in China, as we all know. So the supply chain has extended itself from US-Taiwan to US-Taiwan-China. And now you have this triumvirate, to use the Roman term, where you have a virtuous relationship between the three that allows all parties to benefit in that supply chain, albeit to differing degrees. And ultimately, global consumers, as represented in this room, and we can afford to buy our, we can afford to buy our smartphones and our computers and laptops in a way that, frankly, we would not be able to if they were manufactured here in our country, or perhaps if you lived in Europe in somewhere like the UK or France. So the supply chain has allowed for dynamic research and development. It has allowed for continued downward pressure on pricing that has ensured that we've seen forward momentum in the research and development of increasingly sophisticated, smaller, dynamic devices, platforms to entertain us, to improve productivity. And there isn't a more important relationship than the US-Taiwan-China supply chain in making that happen. What you've had most recently now is, up to that point, most of the design was done by the HPs, the Apples, the Dells, and so on. With a company like Apple, yes, you still get a good degree of design going on here in the US, and certainly IP ownership, but most of the companies now for laptops, PCs, and other consumer devices, the design is done by the Taiwan company as well. So you might buy a Dell or an HP, but it still may be designed by the same Taiwan business and manufactured in the same facility in China, even if it's branded differently. I do want to quickly touch on something that has been announced just recently, just in the last month, in fact. Lenovo, the Chinese PC manufacturer, hardware manufacturer, you may recall it bought IBM's hardware line, and Apple have both made announcements about doing production here in the United States. I wouldn't get excited about that if you sit in the camp where this sort of manufacturing is the solution to what ails us as a country. These are sort of niche announcements, and they are principally related to two things. One is the importance of public procurement here in the United States and a requirement to do manufacturing here in the US for sale to the government, local or federal. And part of it is political, and a desire to impress upon our leadership that there is some manufacturing investment being done here. It will remain extremely modest and ultimately won't have an impact on the sort of dynamics that are driving supply chain evolution. The freest part of the Taiwan economy is the tech economy. Taiwan's economy at the moment remains in, frankly, deep distress. It's barely growing. The estimates are about 1.5%, maybe a little less by the government. The estimates by financial institutions, certainly that we see at the US-Taiwan Business Council, are frankly more modest than that. Taiwan will barely grow this year, and frankly next year isn't looking that much better. Unemployment is still relatively low, which is a good thing, and that's partly a function of the increase in tourism, some investment going on within the country to improve infrastructure, and yet you also have a good degree of underemployment. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask, should you wish to ask it, that yes, unemployment is relatively low, but you also have a lot of underutilization amongst the working population in Taiwan. So there's some distress within the Taiwan economy, and really looking at two areas within that. One is an inability or an unwillingness in respect to the political class to push domestic reform, and the other side of it is the lack of global demand in three main areas: China, Europe, and the United States. Ma Ying-jeou, in fairness, who was re-elected, the president of Taiwan, who was re-elected in January of this year, did make several initial steps at the beginning of this year to try and tackle some domestic reform areas. One, I think, is an excellent one, which is the fixing of energy prices, which promoted cheap energy for energy waste, poor energy investment in infrastructure. He tried to change that and really met a firestorm back in his face. Frankly, I think it was extremely unfair. He's criticized for not tackling domestic economic reform. When he made a legitimate attempt to do that, domestic political forces absolutely hammered him. So the Ma government is not popular at the moment, according to many polls. And as it looks at the sort of reform that it can undertake, it appears to be already bloodied in respect to being proactive on its own front. So what we hear now principally from the Ma government in respect to domestic economic reform is the imperative of Taiwan's inclusion in global trade agreements, whether they be bilateral or inclusion in multilateral agreements. Many countries do that, and but none of them are in the kind of political bind that Taiwan is. So it's one thing for President Ma to call for inclusion in TPP or in other trade agreements, but the politics of inclusion are vastly more complicated than they are for a country with globally recognized sovereignty. Taiwan has a well-publicized and in some quarters controversial free trade agreement with the Chinese, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, and it has improved Taiwan's competitiveness and access to one of its largest market. It hasn't had that much of an impact on the tech sector, frankly, because the tech sector globally, as well as in Taiwan-China relations, has relatively low barriers to the exchange of goods and services. Principally, the only barrier you're going to run into is where the IP standard for a particular area is so high that the Taiwan government really forbids it. I think an excellent example is if you look at the semiconductor manufacturing standards, and please excuse me for getting a little technical here, but the most used higher standard right now is 12 inch, 300 millimeter, and there remains an across-the-board ban on the part of the Taiwan government for investment in China at that level for Taiwan semiconductor companies. Taiwan Semiconductor, TSMC, is the only Taiwan chip company at present manufacturing in China, although another large Taiwan manufacturer does have an equity investment in a large Chinese manufacturer. Taiwan, 20, 30 years ago, I think could argue fairly that it was on parity with the South Koreans, that things were going, they were competing well with the South Koreans. There's certainly, when you talk to Taiwanese business people or the Taiwan government about the future prospects or the present situation for the Taiwan economy and certain sectors, 30 years ago, we're doing okay, we're competing with the South Koreans, they're really our head-to-head competitor, and we're doing all right. We could do better, but we're doing all right. Now that's not the case. The South Koreans are beginning to, are significantly pulling away from Taiwan. And it's a big problem. It is recognized in Taiwan. However, the response is as yet unclear from the Taiwanese. And I'm going to touch on that a little bit. But the point I want to simply make at this section is that Samsung casts the South Koreans cast an extremely long shadow across Taiwan's economy, and Samsung is very much at the heart of it. For those of us who work in a lot in the tech sector, as we do at the US Taiwan Business Council, it's our largest sector of members, Samsung comes up all the time. Two main areas. One, as a supply chain participant providing components and as a systems integrator for finishing products, as well as a branded competitor. Some of you may have Samsung phones, some of you may have Samsung televisions, etc. So Taiwan's situation at the moment is one that we have some distress. There's certainly some angst about what the future holds for Taiwan. But there are also some relatively encouraging developments. And I'm going to start by looking north of Taiwan toward Japan. Japan's misfortunes at this moment economically might very well turn out to be Taiwan's fortunes. And I think there are a couple of examples we can look at that bear this out. Japan's tech industry is in distress. There's overcapacity. It's not as competitive as it used to be, or is not competitive any longer. It has attempted to diversify and invest in China. That's problematic because of the history of Japanese relations with China that has degraded over the last few years as Chinese nationalism has risen, and now we have the issue with the Senkaku Islands and China's, frankly, continued walkout of its nationalist interests and bumping into the Japanese and those in ASEAN who have territorial issues in the South China Sea. This is creating very real problems for Japanese investors in China. And they're having problems investing new money. They're having problems investing in their present facilities, and they're having problems managing their facilities. Spot tax checks, people just turning up and wanting to look at all the books. I mean, real sort of harassment stuff. And the Japanese don't want to leave China. They're already overexposed, as Taiwan is as well. And so they have a requirement to take care of the investments that they have. But they also have a requirement to make a change. So what you're seeing in the former of those two issues is Taiwanese management of Japanese investments in China increasing dramatically. Taiwanese workers have tremendous experience in the supply chain. The competition for for Taiwan supply chain managers is extremely intense. And you're beginning to see more and more of them turn up running Japanese investments in the mainland in individual capacities, and sometimes lock, stock, and two smoking barrels in the entire sense. What you're also seeing, and I touched on this just at the beginning, is given the lack of competitiveness within Japan, mostly as a function of protectionism, you're seeing Japanese tech companies, branded tech companies, I think Sony is a very good example here, looking now at the supply chain and its requirement to start diversifying away from manufacturing all its gear itself and starting to look at ways in which these companies can improve profitability and improve the amount of money that they have to invest in R&D and new products. And so what you're starting to see now is companies like Sony offload significant amounts of production to companies like Honhai, Quanta, and Compaq and others. Compal and others who play significantly in the supply chain space. This is good for Taiwan, although the margins in producing other people's hardware are very tight, because what's happening is it's drawing the Japanese and Taiwanese economies again more closely together. And I think mostly in the tech sector, this is important because what the Japanese do have a lot of is intellectual property. And what the Taiwanese don't have a lot of is intellectual property. So there is genuinely a marriage to be made here. And if we look at the semiconductor industry for a second, we have a very important semiconductor company here in the US called Micron. Some of you may be familiar with it. Micron is principally known for the production of DRAM chips, memory chips. And it has a very significant investment in Taiwan. And Micron has just bought a Japanese company called Elpida. Elpida, again, poster child for the description I've just made, high debt, shrinking market, but lots and lots of IP and a production process. This is very important in the chip space, a production process that a number of semiconductor companies around the world use. So what we've seen here is a US company, Micron, go into Japan with with a significant footprint in Taiwan, significant relationships with the Taiwan semiconductor industry, going up to Japan, procuring Elpida and its IP, and then tying that into its Taiwan footprint in a way in which that process, that production process, will now be available to build on in Taiwan in a way that it never was before, bringing in significant amounts of IP for Taiwanese businesses to build around. And this has a great deal of attraction. The New York Times did a very good piece several years ago about the iPhone, and I'll just cite the data there. But if you look at the price of an iPhone, 18% is the hardware, right? 82% is the IP within the hardware, right? It's the hardware's where the money is, and it's no mistake as a consequence that Apple's the most valuable company in the world, right? It doesn't need, nor should it, manufacture its own hardware. It's not where the money is. So you've got this dynamic US, in this interest, US, Taiwan, Japan, where a US company, Micron's gone in with capital and procured Elpida, bought Elpida, and now is really focused in on Taiwan and developing that. I'm just going to speak for a couple of minutes, then I'll wrap up. Another example I want to give is Sharp. Many of you may remember that brand from years gone by. They were certainly very well known for their televisions, but in many other areas as well. Sharp's fortunes have fallen dramatically over the last few years. But again, what Sharp has bucket loads of is IP. And we've seen two important transactions in the last 12 months regarding Sharp. The first is Qualcomm. That came just in the last month. Qualcomm is a semiconductor company based in San Diego. Very good one, very large one, particularly focused on the telecom space. We work with them at the US Taiwan Business Council. And Honhai, the systems integrator in Taiwan, Taiwan's largest company. Both of them have taken equity stakes in Sharp. Honhai for the IP, all right? And Qualcomm, again, to participate in the development of next-generation telecom products. But again, the supply chain has drawn these companies together, and what they're principally focusing in on is the intellectual property embedded in these Japanese companies. What they do not want to get caught up in is the sort of IP warfare that Apple certainly likes to wage, and that can cost businesses greatly. It can even put them out of business. So companies are looking to amass IP, whether through the development of their own or through purchasing companies that are sitting on a great deal of IP. So I think there are some interesting dynamics going on here between Taiwan and Japan, and attempts to purchase chunks of IP along with developing intellectual property on its own. The Taiwan government is doing two things, I think, that are important in encouraging this. The first is it really has done a remarkable job over the last decade in protecting intellectual property or improving the environment for IP. That was started under Chen Shui-bian in 2004. And you've seen it all and through the basic laws governing the protection of IP, all the way through to this legislative yuan session going on right now, where you're seeing significant legislation just passed on the criminalization of taking IP principally over to China. What we've seen happen very publicly with Taiwan Semiconductor, and then a US company called Corning. We may know it's a glass company, was very well known for fiber optics. Now Corning is the leader in making glass that goes on much of the devices that you buy. And Corning lost a chunk of its people that just got up, took a whole bunch of their systems technology and went off to China and started a business. That sort of stuff can can destroy a company, irrespective of how big it is. And Taiwan has done an excellent job of moving forward and tackling that through legislation and properly criminalizing this stuff. Not just a slap on the hand and a $10 fine, but going to prison, you know, millions of NT in fines, significant penalties for these sorts of actions. You can never stamp it out, but you can make the cost of breaking the law very high. So looking into the future, I would suggest to all of you that what you're going to see in Taiwan a great deal is continued angst about competition from the South Koreans, and particularly from Samsung. I would encourage all of you, such as you're interested in this subject matter, to read articles about Samsung when you see them in the newspaper. Not necessarily results of how Samsung's doing. That stuff's probably pretty dry. But when you see when something strikes you as more of a strategic decision, because then I think what you're going to see is a global leader setting the tone for particular decisions that others will follow. The example I will give and then stop is that Apple announced this week that it's looking at making its own televisions, right? That is almost certainly a function of the fact that Samsung is already making its own TVs, its own hardware. Samsung has the capacity, or is already undertaking convergence amongst a wide number of platforms to ensure that it can serve its customers at all areas in which they're accessing higher end products and services. Apple wants that too. Apple does not have access totally. They have Apple TV, but they don't have their own TVs, so their own technology is not going into those TVs. So you see them make that decision. I would suggest to you all that what Samsung is doing influenced that decision, and that's the sort of headline that's making it into the front page of the Wall Street Journal and other newspapers. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Do I have the remote control?
Oh, sure.
And how did you turn on here? This is on, right?
Let's have a look, please.
Oh, okay.
Oh, yeah, good, thanks.
I know I can do this. Sorry.
It's down. Right there on the no, right. The last one. Yeah, that one.
Should I start or? Oh, okay. All right, sorry. First of all, I'd like to thank Shihoto Goto and the Western Center to give me this opportunity to summarize some of my research project. But it's very hard for me to say anything after two, excellent presentation from the two distinguished panelists. And also, I feel very uncomfortable because I'm the only one probably living in the ivory tower and speak to the policymaker, to the audience, mostly in Washington, D.C. Essentially, I try to talk about a more macro prospect of Taiwan's industrial policy. But this doesn't move, right? Can I move? Okay. Thanks. I prepare about 60 slides, but I have only about 20 minutes. So I don't know how I'm going to do. No? Okay. All right. Essentially, I have about 6 parts of my presentation. The first one was the industrial policy in the early period, which tied with export-led growth strategy under the developmental state. The second part, I explained how come that the Taiwan's economy after 1980 was different from what it happened in 60 and 70. So I given the diminishing role of the authoritarian regime. And then I will talk about the new functional approach undertaken by the government. But I'm going to focus on number 4 and number 5, talk about the future to tie it with the 2 excellent presentations. I can only summarize what happened in the first period. That is, during the 60, early 50, 60, and even early until 1970, the government was able to initiate the industry-specific development policy. Nevertheless, the situation changed, and I come to 2 remarks. There are 2 major drawbacks on that kind of policy in the 50 and the 60. The first one was the discretionary effect. That is, the government, too much discretions. And number 2 was the inconsistency of the criteria in picking up the so-called strategic industry. All right. So that is a new situation. And then because Rup mentioned about Korea, I shall make a comment. That is, the industrial organization in Taiwan is very different from what was in South Korea. Instead of the conglomerate we call Chiobu in Korea, Taiwan's most dominant in SME, the small and the medium business. And so their focus are all different. And this has a good reason to explain how come Taiwan doesn't have its own brand name like a Samsung or LG, which I will touch upon that. All right, and the diminishing role of the developmental state, also coincident with what happened in the United States and in England. All right, in the 80s, this was a new liberalism in the U.S. under President Reagan, and in Europe, it's Margaret Thatcher's. So they all emphasize more on deregulations and more economic liberalizations. Therefore, government law has to be shifted. That's intellectually. And also that, we should say that it's much easier for government to identify those industries in the early period and then support it and then, push for it. But it's much difficult, after the economy becomes more mature, all right? And also that when the technological gap becomes narrow, it is hard for the government to identify which industry to support and to promote. But this is not, Taiwan is not alone in affair to achieve those industrial development. We also observe similar experience, and this is not to form the excuse, but I'm going to share with you similar experience were observed in Thailand's state enterprise program in the 60s. Korea in the 70s also engaged on the HCI, the heavy chemical industry drive, and Singapore engaged in the higher wage policy in the mid-80s, and Malaysia's on the heavy industrial plan. In other words, that the government initiate the industrial policy may not success after the situation changes. And I think I should put quickly to the problems of the limit of the sectorial industrial development. That is, first of all, government has to identify which sector to develop. Second one, the government has to offer the policy incentive, more carrots, less stick, all right? But in terms of implementation, we found a lot of inconsistency. And one of the other questions is that after the 80s, the size of the high tech, which is highly oligopoly, is a monopoly, but highly oligopoly, and also the reorientation of the traditional, the old conglomerate, which enter into the industry like HTC, which was from Formosa Plastic Group. So government, changed its law as a functional approach, and to drive for the promotion of industrial policies. All right, and government, support the research and development. Here are the major policy taken in the 80s. First one is to establish and providing the institutional infrastructures, which will promote the technology innovation and industrial development. The typical example is ITIR and Science Industrial Park. And number 2, Taiwan is an island, is a trade-dependent economy, has to drive for more and more trade liberalizations in order to integrate with the global economy. So they undertaking the trade liberalizations as well as the globalizations, which has a significant effect not only on the trade structure but also industrial policy. All right, so this I already report, say the ITRI, the Industrial Technology Research Institute, and the spin off the TSMC and the UMC, all right? And also that, instead of picking up the winner, as what Japan and Korea did, Taiwan's model of industrialization is to use the ITRI to provide the technical support for the private industry and execute some financial prudence to support the industrial development. And then Taiwan has to engage on the trade liberalizations, particularly after the currency appreciation of the Plaza Accord. Plaza Accord is a very significant impact on all the Asia countries, not only Japan, Korea, Taiwan, but all other Asia countries as well. And then Taiwan has to drive the globalizations, which has a new division of labor. I think this is the diagram in my book, that I put it. Country A, like the United States or Japan, provide some of the technology know-how and some intermediate product, which ship into Taiwan as intermediate, positions, and then add on their domestic labor and the skills. And then two parts. Some of the final goods export to OECD, but others, particularly after 1990s, what Taiwan export is a parts and a component, and to shift to China and Southeast Asia for further process before they reach the final destination of US and I'll skip that. This is what I calculate on the vertical specialization index, which is too theoretical. And then, of course, Taiwan has to pursue the national technology capability. And so a set of the science and industrial development will be necessary. There are four key features of Taiwan's hybrid mix of the tech global means and the tech national ends. All right. Number one is a low-cost competence building to create strategic suppliers. Number two is the use of the multiple channels to access the technology. And number three, Taiwan take a much more liberal policy in terms of the foreign investment and foreign multinational cooperation than Korea until the 1997-1998 financial crisis. And then some criticism was that Taiwan may not smart enough that to avoid the full sectorism. That is, the sector which Taiwan do much better is just the parts and component rather than the full set. All right, and I don't have time to get into the detail of that. So the interdependency of the technology was built up. Number one, the strategic alliance with the world-class multinational corporations, and then use the leverage of MNC to create a domestic industry. All right. And number three is to move up to the global value chain, which loops there, all right? And then I want to move to the, this is, talk about the story of the foundry model of the TSMC, all right? And then others. Now, here, this is original from Stan Xu, the smiling curve. See, the value added vertically, is most important at the innovate, on the left side is the innovation and the patents. And then, gradually, the product development, the value added decline. And then production and assembly, I should put assembly at the bottom. And then that is a low value added. And then after that, the logistics and marketing and the brand name, that has a higher value added. Now, in my new book, I study the problem of the OEM, original equipment manufacturer, original design manufacturer, and the OBM. And I try to figure out where does the Taiwan's comparative advantage really lies. All right. We all know that in the high tech, okay, they develop several stages. One is innovation, and then the product development, and then manufacture, and assembly, and then logistics and branding. Taiwan has a comparative advantage as a second mover on the manufacture. And as a second movers, all right. But in terms of ODM, Taiwan is more advanced by moving up to some of the design and the logistic, and then talking about the original branding. Taiwan has a strong rivals to compete with the forced rivals, and then now to compete with Korea. And all right, but because the OEM the product life cycle is very short, and the fixed cost, the production, the manufacture fixed cost of manufacture is very high, and so Taiwan the profit margin was very low. Therefore, they had to reduce the cost by outsource. All right, and so the other question is that in some part of the ITC sector, Taiwan do much better at the CD rather than at the hard disk drive. Hard disk drive HDD. The main reason was because that the HDD require a large economies of scale. Taiwanese company can hardly compete with the large conglomerate from South Korea. And Taiwan did much better on the CD, ROM, the read-only memory, and recordable CD. The reason for that is because the Taiwanese government banned the electronic game in the 80s. They do not allow that that game, and so they just had to develop that case. So there's some coincidence, all right. Okay, I want to shift to the more recent one. That is, as a resources poor country, Taiwan has to rely more on the brand power rather than the cheap labor. So Taiwan has to develop the knowledge-based economy, and also shift to the service sector. In 2001, during the DDP government, they proposed the so-called knowledge-based economy through industrial deepening. All right, and there are several stages that they pursue, like set up the mechanism to encourage innovation and foster new venture, expand the use of information technology and the internet, lay the groundwork for the environmental support for internet, and consider deep modification of the educational system and establish a service-oriented government. Taiwan tried to push the research and development, reach about 3% of the GDP, which barely reach, all right? And to enhance the contribution of the technological progress, which hope to account for about 75% of the economic growth. That target hasn't reached yet. And also boost more government spending on education, and increase the the production values as a percentage of the knowledge intents. This is the ground map from the CEPD, the Council for Economic Planning and Development. But unfortunately, there's too many shifts of the premiership during the DPP administration, so that the knowledge-based economy was not pursued as it's supposed to. All right, and under this knowledge-based economy, there are about 10 emerging industries which target by the government. And the DPP government also expand the 10 sectors into 18 sectors. And I don't have time to get into that, but I can share that with you. I want to talk about major policy measures, all right, to increase the research and development, all right. And what is the result? This is the patent right granted by the U.S. government. In terms of total number of the patents granted by the United States government, Taiwan comes about number 5 in the last couple of years from 2010, all right? But if we divide by the population, this is the number of the patents per 1 million. Taiwan, number of the patents granted per million populations. Taiwan counts as number 1, since 2006 to 2010. But I did realize, and I noticed that the speed, even though Taiwan's come number 1, but the speed of the growth in South Korea being granting the patent right was much faster than Taiwan. And this is in terms of the allocation or the distribution of the patent right among the private enterprise, the government, and the research institutions. All right. And what I want to say is that the Korean patent right continue to increase much faster in terms of growth rate than Taiwan in the past decade. And in addition to the strong rival from Korea, Taiwan also faced a very, very strong challenge from the emerging China. In other words, China, although we said we count as a low-cost labor, but China start to pick up some of the technology. And I hope I have time to cover that. Now, what area that the Taiwan has the strengths? And then we break down into the fields, in the technological field, all right? Some are higher in the biotech, in the organic chemistry, in the pharmaceutical, on the food chemistry, on the, some other sectors, all right? And this is similar to Samsung. Now, what is the score, right? In terms of the pursuit of the knowledge-based economy. Look at the 2010, all right? The percentage of the Taiwan's total export, which are based on the high-tech product, account about 66.8%, roughly about 2/3, a little bit more than 2/3 of Taiwan's export are on the high-tech product. All right, and we should remember that in the early 50s, the major export from Taiwan is rice and sugar, and it's hard to believe that that the economy changed that fast. Nevertheless, there's a further room of improvement. Look at the stage of development. Stage number 1 is a factor driving, that you have the cheap labor, the natural resources. That was when the per capita income was less than 2,000. The second transitional period was that when the per capita income increased over 2,000 and to less than 3,000. That should be emphasized on the efficiency. And I'm sorry, on the transitional period. And then when the per capita income, is more than 3,000 to about 9,000, then productivity is more important. So efficiencies. But now Taiwan had to move to the stage number 3. That's the innovation divisions. That is when per capita income is greater than 17,000. Taiwan should focus on the innovation, the scientific innovation. And I don't have much time to cover into that. I should say that in terms of the stage of development, Taiwan was again defined as an innovation driving after the 2008, and was this among the advanced Asian countries, including Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea. All right. Now, looking at the global competitive report, and I just got the most recent one, is a 2012 to 2013. Taiwan maintained number 13. Taiwan maintained 13th position for the 3rd year in a row. His competitiveness profile is essentially unchanged and consistently strong. All right. So in terms of global competitiveness, now, even though that we recognize the importance, the achievement, the significant achievement of the scientific innovation, most of the Taiwan's the patent right were granted on the process innovation rather than the product innovation. Therefore, in terms of the trade in technology, that is, technology export and import, pure technology export import, Taiwan still suffering from deficit in the trade in technology. And as I said, the main reason was that most of the Taiwanese innovation were focused on the process innovation, which is new to the country, but rather than not a new product, rather than new to the world. So technology export is still limited. And in most of the industrial countries, services sector account for more than 70% or even higher. The services sector in Taiwan reached about 67% of the total GDP in 2010, account about 59% of the total labor employment. There's substantial room for improvement in Taiwan, the service industry, to promote it as a more mature economy. In the services sector, Taiwan has identified about 10 sectors to globalize Taiwan's services sector, such as food industry, medical travel, international logistics, pop music, digital content platform, and so on and so forth. All right. And the major policy initiative for the industrial development in the past decade, including to push for 6 emerging industries: biotech, tourism, green energy, medical care, quality agriculture, culture, and the creative industry. All right. And recently, the government also pushed for the so-called 4 intelligent industry to enhance the competitive advantage of Taiwan's ITC industry. Now, I think I had to move to the conclusion, otherwise I'll be running out of time. One is the national image and the branding assistance, all right? And the other is the increasing share of the outsource, particularly on the IT industry. And number 3 is a growing concern about the asymmetrical dependency on the Chinese market. And number 4 is internationalization of the service industry. One of the last is economic security on the technological transfer or the dual use of the high-tech industry, particularly on the semiconductors. All right. I cite a scholar like Klaus Kroll says, power rises from asymmetrical interdependency. It does not matter whether a conservative actor uses a carrot or the stick. But I think the Taiwanese government seems not to take any visible actions to protect his own economic and the political security of the de facto autonomies when deal with China. All right. I'm not under the Cold War ideology. I'm just concerned that the economic security cannot be separate from the national security. And therefore, there are some discussions and highly debate in Taiwan and overseas. Given the unique relationship between China and Taiwan, the globalization has a substantial eroded the capacity and autonomy of the state versus the non-state actors. All right? Technological transfer from the semiconductor industry to China without public scrutiny on transfer of the dual use of the technology probably will threaten Taiwan's long-term survival. And this is from the dissertation from Monica Chu at the London School, University of London, SOAS. University of London, SOAS, all right? The strategic nature of the semiconductor industry dictates that Taiwan would need to have a set of technological transfer policy. All right, and here I give you some statistics. We don't have time to go into that. There's some product which made in Taiwan, which accounts number 1. But there are more products which made by Taiwan. So in the past, we talk about made in Taiwan, but now there's more and more product made by Taiwan in China, or made by Taiwan in Malaysia. All right. And with the time constraint, I think I can just roughly report to this to you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. I'm sure we all have a lot of questions to ask, but as the moderator, I actually get first dibs. So I actually have 2 questions for Alejandro. Political risk, especially given the current situation between China, Japan, and South Korea, is in the headlines all the time. Is that something that is accounted for in the Doing Business indicator? That's my first question. And if so, how it is. And secondly, free trade agreements. We are currently discussing a great deal about the prospects for TPP, whether it may move forward or not. Asia has its own alternative trade scheme. Does that also count into measuring the business-friendly atmosphere of a country or not, and how do you assess that?
Okay. So first of all, I have to remind you again that our report is very limited to the regulations and how it affects the medium and small entrepreneurs in each country. So unfortunately, issues like political risk, which are very important, are not accounted in our report. So this is it's outside our scope of the report. Regarding free trade agreements, even again, if the report doesn't cover these kind of political issues to see the trade agreements between countries, we do have an indicator on trade, and it basically measures how easy or how hard it is to trade, to export and import from the main trade partner. And we see that Taiwan is doing okay relatively to the region and to the world, but it has room for improvement if you compare it to economies like Korea or Singapore or even sometimes in Malaysia. So we see that regulations can improve and help entrepreneurs in this area. And we've seen in other countries where we have free trade agreements, maybe if regulations also help the new markets opening to make things a little more streamlined and more efficient, can have a positive impact.
Thank you. There is a microphone. If you could wait for it to come to you, and if you could also identify yourself and ask whatever you would like. Questions? Yes.
If you're not taping, I have a very loud voice.
I think, unfortunately, we do need a microphone. Thank you, though.
Thank you. Okay. Thomas Young, American University. I have a dual question. One is academic, and then the second part of the same question is more policy relevant. Professor Cho spoke about developmental state early in your presentation, and you even mentioned then in your presentation very briefly that it's easier to apply industrial policy to catch up industrialization than to high-tech economies. And so my first question really is there a developmental state, is there developmentalism in a high-tech economy, or can the government, what's the role of the government in essentially governing a high-tech market, right, to use that term, governing the market. And the second part, then it goes into policy, or also theory. The developmental state, one of the main aspects of developmental state was the autonomy of regulators, so shielding it from political repercussions. So that works in authoritarian states. And both Taiwan and Korea, which we've both mentioned, they are both fairly messy democracies today, multi-party with very contested politics. So I wonder if, even if your answer is yes, a state can govern a high-tech market, I wonder if Taiwan and Korea really can govern any market today in the way the developmental state could, given that they are fairly messy democracies today, which is not developmental state theory. Thank you.
So you want me to answer this first question? All right. In one of my recent papers, I talk about is a waning developmental state. That is to say, what did in the past can no longer replicate in the future and now. All right. And main reason is after becoming a democratic country, the government is under the periodic political pressure of elections. Under the authoritarian regime, the political leader legitimizes his leadership by economic performances without the pressure. Therefore, government bureaucrat is insulated from the pressure group, So therefore, that the sectorial development policy no longer work. All right. Now, your question is, can we apply this development model to support the high-tech industry in a different direction, in the sense that provide the infrastructure, such as research and development, provide more maybe incentive, tax incentive, and some of the logistical support, rather than to tell the industry or the private sector which product you to produce, and I give you the money, which industry you to produce, and I support you, rather than specific industrial development policy, given an overall grand strategy, which create the entrepreneurships to overcome their barriers. And this is in literature we call it a coordination of value. That is to say, government is not the parents. It's not the parents that tell the kids how to do it, but rather than watch what they do and then provide the necessary service. Korea is different from Taiwan in the sense that Korean Chiobu, they rely so much on the government support, even though that it's after democracy and there will be election pretty soon, right? 2 weeks or 1 week from now. The Chiobu rely on the government support by providing the concessional loan, a low-cost loan, and so on and so forth. But now the private sector in Taiwan, they does not require that much from the government to do that. So even if the Taiwan is going to, pick up some lesson from the Korean, it doesn't work, all right? And I don't have time to go into the branding. You know, I tried to say that in terms of the branding, let's say how come Taiwan doesn't have its own brand name? Number one is that you know, there are more barriers, more technological barrier, more scale economy barrier, and more cultural barrier to build one own brand name, which require a larger domestic market. Korean population is 2 times higher, but more than 2 times higher than Taiwan. So the size of domestic market in Korea is much larger, number one. And number two is that, you know, to build up, to establish the national brand require a stronger support, resources, you know, support from the government, which Taiwanese government, regardless of which party is in power, has no longer that kinds of privilege to support that. And number three is a cultural barrier. That is to say that you have to know a lot of the culture on the consumer market in order to overcome it. So that is something that Taiwan is behind South Korea. Most of the brand name, like HTC, you know, smartphone and so on and so forth, are not from the largest scale company in Taiwan, but rather than the secondary. All right. And in terms of the policy, should Taiwan follow the Korean step to develop its own brand name, unless Taiwan can find another market, which is pretty close to his, you know, cultural and social aspect, and to do this kind of trial basis. But otherwise, you know, Taiwan probably stay as a, you know, a provider of the strategic component. Look at automobile industry. In the 80s, Taiwan debate whether or not Taiwan should have the automobile industry. And actually, Toyota negotiate with Taiwan first before Toyota negotiate with Hyundai. But Taiwanese government declined the offer because Taiwan require Toyota to have more, domestic parts. That is, you know, more local content, not local content. I don't know whether it's right or wrong, but in terms of auto parts, Taiwan do a good business. I think Ruth has more data that the Taiwanese auto parts, you know, export pretty well. So it's a problem like a Belgium and Germany, right? Belgium does not produce his own automobile to compete with the Germans' Passat or some other car, no, right? But Belgium's economy do reasonably well without his brand name.
They make good beer and French fries.
Built car parts in Austria and Europe. Austria makes the car parts.
Yeah.
Just to add to that, I think that you know, my inclination is always to say, particularly in the tech industry, that the government's role is to get out of the way, and I'll stick with that overall premise. But I would like to add that, in fairness to Taiwan, on the history, Taiwan's institutions, Peter mentioned ITRI, which is an extremely, arguably the most important technology organization in Taiwan. But there's also III, the Institute for Information Industry, and there's also Taiwan's version of DARPA, which is called CSIST. Those three institutions, along with several others, do good government-funded R&D, and it has produced technology that can be commercialized. But mostly, it's the technology innovation is coming out of the companies free of government support and government interference in some instances. However, government policy can and does matter. And I'd cite for you several areas where I think Taiwan has got it right and where it's having a difference, or is making a difference. Tax policies. Taiwan is, among many countries other than our own, is actually reducing its tax rates, particularly in the corporate area, making its economy more competitive. And that's attracting interest from global companies. IP protection, I mentioned to you all. That is, I cannot stress enough how important that is, particularly given Taiwan's integrated commercial relationship with the Chinese and the degree to which companies look at not Taiwan separate China. They look at an integrated Greater China market. In some instances, it's North Asia, but often the companies the big tech companies will look at it as an integrated Greater China market, and they will decide how to base their integrated operations. Some of the manufacturing inclination is to go to China, but what we're seeing now is a significant relook at Taiwan from an R&D higher end standpoint, because the companies feel like they can get better IP protection for anything that they develop. You look at Qualcomm announced $1 billion investment just last year. I mentioned the Qualcomm investment in Sharp that'll have a significant, Sharp will have a significant Taiwan component. Applied Materials, the list is actually pretty long for the last couple of years. Access to partners, and the other part I would make from government policy standpoint is access to markets. And I do believe that both the last two presidents of Taiwan have understood clearly the importance of Taiwan's access to markets, although, as I pointed out, as much as government policy might promote inclusion in regional and global trade agreements, Taiwan is faced with a very significant headwind on that front, from the politics of which come from China. And then just quickly, I absolutely agree with Peter on the brand building side of things, in the way he broke it down. But I will continue to argue that it is essential that Taiwan continue the long slog towards building global brands, and the value inherent in owning your own intellectual property wrapped around your own brands. And that there is a cultural pushback, given that the sales cycle, particularly in tech, is extremely tight. You know, you're talking a month or a quarter, and the Taiwanese companies are within the supply chain and generally are very much conditioned to tight sales cycles, and not the longer, more drawn-out research development of products and then the sale of products that come with building your own brand and the significant investment in marketing those brands. That impacts short-term profitability, with the notion that you might be able to make more money down the road, and that's just not hot-wired into the Taiwan commercial culture.
Any more questions? Bob.
Bob Hathaway here at the center. Kudos to all three of our speakers for very interesting insights into what I think is not a sufficiently understood set of topics here. So thanks very much for making us a bit smarter. I want to invite any of you to tease out a bit more a topic which was briefly alluded to, and that is the tension between economic gain and geopolitical or security risk. In this city, you're all aware, this is an ongoing debate. Can we afford to do business with governments or countries who might already be rivals or competitors or even potential adversaries? This obviously is pertinent. I think in the case of Taiwan, most immediately with respect to high-tech trade with and other business interactions with the mainland. So I'd like any or all of you to discuss a little bit more how the Taiwanese are dealing with this issue and how successful you think they've been in dealing with this issue.
Well, this is, Bob, good to hear your comment. And this is very serious issues. And most of my fellow economists don't want to touch upon it. But I did invite in a group of scholars, to edit a book entitled National Identity and Economic Interest. Basically talk about the cross-trade, investment, and international trade, including the technological transfer. And we did mention that, the geopolitics is a factor which is essential for the national securities, all right? And so that is in the academy. But in terms of the policymaker in the government, it depends on the government's leadership, with a immature democracy. I think most likely the incumbent government is going to yield to the pressure group from the industry or the private sectors, and so that you see that in the last 4 years or more, you have all the policy to trade and invest with China is all liberalized, leave the control. Everything is like, And that's why I say, do they aware of the asymmetric, dependency or not? As a scholar, as an intellectual, I had to bring my concern. And I appreciate that you mentioned that. So maybe I should quote you what you say in the future. All right.
There
Now,
will go your credibility.
but also that, in the United States, I think the President Obama did take a very correct approach to engage on the TPP. That is the only trade pact that the Obama administration, adopt and try to push it. And I'm glad that the Wilson Center will have a serious discussion on that. But in my conclusion, I don't have time to read that. I think please, I had to read this. I talk about trade asymmetric. Oh yeah, trade asymmetric. Asymmetric trade depends on China. I said one way to diversify Taiwan's trade dependency on China's market is to allow Taiwan to sign multiple trade pacts with the United States, Japan, EU, and ASEAN country. And in my new book on the trade industrial development in East Asia, published this spring, I have one chapter to analyze the economic integration in Asia-Pacific region, and to what extent, number one, what is the role played by the United States? Action or inaction is going to significantly affect not just the trade and investment and economic prosperity, but also the U.S. as a Pacific power in the region. I will send you the chapter if you like. And I'll send you a chapter about that too. Okay. That is, in addition to the technical analysis, most of this is statistical analysis. But I did mention that it would be too naive to think that economic trade agreement, free trade, has no political motivation. I don't agree with most of my fellow economists. Say we economists, we don't have to worry about that. We just do the computer and do the statistical analysis. I said, man, there's a strong economic implication. I mean, it's a strong political implication beyond the economic integration, all right? So I sent you that chapter after, if you like. I mean, that's not non-technical chapter. That's to what extent the U.S. action or inaction, to what extent will affect not just the economic prosperity in the region, Asia-Pacific, but also in terms of the U.S. as a Pacific power. All right. I appreciate that, Bob.
Any further questions? Oh, sorry. I'm so sorry.
No, I just wanted to say that I will let you talk about this area because I don't want to bore you with the geopolitical views of a technocrat. So I will let you.
Well, I would just like to add that Taiwan is caught between a rock and a hard place on this issue of overexposure to China. If in fact that's what you're driving at, I'm going to infer that, at least it's to some degree. Obviously, overexposure to China, which Taiwan has, is not in Taiwan's strategic interests. And I think many of us would agree that the Chinese do not have the same intention for their relationship with Taiwan that Taiwan has for its relationship with China. So that over-dependency may be used in the future to hurt Taiwan in very profound ways, even if there is some pain incurred on the China front. That said, the supply chain drives Taiwan investment in ways that are very difficult, near impossible indeed, for the government to control. And I sort of caught a little part of one of your slides, Peter, and excuse me if I misunderstood, but I thought it raised the question that the Taiwan government didn't have enough or didn't have any barriers to semiconductor investment in China. Is that right?
More liberalized.
It is a little bit liberalized, but the economic ministry that manages Taiwan's semiconductor investment in China retains, I would use the word draconian, but very tight regulations on chip investment in the mainland for the very reasons that you point out, Peter, that are important, that these strategic industries don't migrate across, particularly at the higher technology level. But the term in the supply chain is clustering. And what that basically means, so please excuse me for those of you who understand what this word means, is that clustering typically means that the suppliers that produce the components that go into the devices that companies like Hon Hai Foxconn use to assemble into a finished iPhone or some other device cluster around the integrator. So literally the cost of delivering the component that you're producing is only based on traveling a third of a mile or whatever it might be. So it puts in the driver's seat countries that already have significant clustering in them. And China is absolutely high on that list. So it's extremely difficult for Taiwanese businesses that are heavily vested in the supply chain to break out of that because the clustering is already put in place. They did try. There have been several attempts. Li Donghui had his Go South policy in the 90s. Chen Shui-bian had a similar policy for ASEAN, Southeast Asia. And there was even some headway made in the middle part of the last decade to the latter part, where a country like Vietnam saw some significant interest, even land purchase and investment by Taiwanese businesses in the northern part of the country, close to the Chinese border, where they were going to start investing and not putting new facilities or expanding facilities in China. But they ran into some very significant problems, graft, poor infrastructure. They didn't have the workforce that they needed to do it. So there were other circumstances that again brought them back to China. So I think there's broad understanding that there's overexposure in Taiwan in respect to China investment, but they can't help themselves. It's a very, very difficult ship to turn in another direction.
Hey, my name is Gerrit van der Wees. I am with the Formosan Association for Public Affairs. And my question is a little bit related to what Bob just asked. Both Rupert and Peter talked about the Taiwan-China ECFA, Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. And when it was passed 2.5 years ago by the Kuomintang government, it was really presented as a panacea to get Taiwan out of the economic doldrums. But what we see right now is Taiwan is still very much down and out economically. Economic growth this year, 1% or less. So what are the reasons for that? How has ECFA panned out? Can you comment on that?
Well, it is a very controversial issue when that the ECFA trade pact was discussing in Taipei. And number one, how come what happened now was much different from what the government advertised 2 years ago? Is government over-exaggerate the potential benefit, over-exaggerate the potential benefit, and undercut the possible loss. That's number one, and that may be one of the reasons that the economy and the popularity of the incumbent was down in the downturn now. And number two, government can say, well, this trade pact is a framework. It's not a free trade agreement yet, and so therefore there are only X items of the commodity liberalized, and also even among those liberalized items is 3 stages. I think this is the second stage, and then in the third stage they can say, well, the trade barrier is not totally phased out. But I think my argument would be that the trade pact itself, mislead the Taiwan's industry in the sense that Taiwan's competitor in Southeast in Asia is not currently it's not China but rather the Korea, and maybe as a counterpart, I mean as a legacy or the side effect, negative side effect was maybe because of ECFA was a sign, Korea and China move closer together, and then Korea and China and even Japan, despite all those disputes on the territory, their economic minister is working contact to negotiate that. And of course that there'll be election in Japan this weekend and another week in Korea. The next stage we see what will happen. But I think Hiroko asked me a question about that one before start. I said, will those political impact affect the negotiation of trade pact? I say it may delay or slow down a little bit, but basically, Korea, Japan, and China probably will move even closer after the signing of the ECFA, where that is the the potential cost that the government underestimate. And when the government tried to sell the program, it was very controversial. I remember that, and the government only talked about the potential benefit, and even crucified some of the scholars who has a different opinion about it. Thank you.
Well, Garrett, you've heard me say this before, and I'll definitely say it again. I continue to believe that the ECFA was the right decision to make, that there was no alternative for Taiwan, and that, to be fair to the Ma government, they talked about ECFA in the context of a global trade strategy of which this was a component. Where the Ma government has not enjoyed, I believe, the sort of success that it might have hoped for, is in rolling out that global trade strategy beyond just China. And so you have Singapore and New Zealand FTAs to be announced in relatively short order, I understand. But that's it. Some discussions with other countries and the possibility of maybe some announcements in 2013, but absolutely nothing guaranteed. So their global trade strategy is being pitched as, the Ma government's global trade strategy is being pitched as the most significant effort to improve Taiwan's economic competitiveness and therefore its long-term growth rate. But it's caught right now in a China dialogue that's moving forward, albeit slowly, and very little opportunity in the rest of the space. And I'm not bullish on TPP. Some of you may be. I don't see it. Maybe I don't even see it happening, but it seems to be moving extremely slowly. And when it comes to Taiwan, given the complexities of getting Taiwan involved in any kind of multilateral effort, the notion that Taiwan could become involved in TPP seems to me way off in the distance. And by then, and I think it's also important to point out that even if they did, TPP will already have been launched and the founding partners will already have set the standards and the goals and objectives for it. So Taiwan would be a passive, they would be a proactive player within an organization whose goals and objectives had already been set. But where would Taiwan be without the ECFA? I mean, I think that's a reasonable question. Would it be in recession? You know, I don't have an answer to that, but I think it is important to offer that up as a possibility too.
There's an aspect of this over-dependence that you were talking about earlier also.
Oh, sorry, Garrett. It is.
ECFA really increased the over-dependence that you were talking about already. If you had not had ECFA, then Taiwan would have been able to diversify much more than it has and not made itself so vulnerable.
I don't agree with that, Garrett. I just don't. I think the trend lines were there, that they have been since the 90s and accelerated through the DPP government in the last decade. ECFA is providing a more secure base in many respects and certainly opening up new opportunities. But in the answer to the question before, I noted that Taiwan as a country, as well as its companies, have looked at other areas and even made significant attempts to invest in them and have run into significant headway and still pivoted back to China. I'm not disagreeing with the notion of overexposure. That is clear, and it has very serious strategic implications for Taiwan. And Taiwan may simply run out of time to execute a global trade strategy. I mean, that I think is a very fair point.
I'm Mike Fonte. I'm the DPP's Washington liaison. Thanks for very interesting presentations. A lot of questions here, but one big one I guess I would have is Derek Scissors and friends put together a piece about Taiwan can't, because of the political problems with the Chinese blocking a lot of access to other countries and FTAs, instead doing more to invite FDI into Taiwan. I wonder what that looks like from your perspective, and what would it be? What would that mean? How does Taiwan break out of this isolation, not by being able to go out because of the Chinese pressure, but by drawing others into its orbit? Is that a possibility?
That's a difficult question. If I understand your question correctly, you said if Taiwan will feel more secure if they brought in more foreign direct investment in Taiwan?
Because it's problematic to go out because of Chinese
Yeah.
pressure, can it develop inward drawing strategy,
Okay, inward FDI, inward foreign direct in Taiwan is insignificant in terms of the capital formation. That is to say, Taiwan does not need, foreign capital to sustain its economic development. But inward foreign direct could have some other aspect, such as a technological transfer and the market expertise. And it is good to have more inward foreign direct investment from the advanced countries. That is true. All right. But in terms of capital formation, I think, Taiwan does not need much more the foreign capital. The 7 is all domestic investment. All right. But you're right. If they invite more foreign direct investment, may increase. But in that regard, how can you invite, like Alexander said, how can you invite more foreign direct? You have to liberalize your trade structure. You have to deregulate your domestic economy. All right. And I want to respond to Ruth's question. That is, if the ECFA will be part of the global strategy, then we should see that the government should be pursued more forcefully, more energetically, and more aggressively to seek for the bilateral, if not the multilateral, free trade agreement. That's at least one thing we agree on this part. Of course, I'm not so naive. Say, okay, Taiwan is going to join the TPP tomorrow. No, but I think that that should be a long-term goal.
I agree with Peter. I agree with you, Peter, in lots of stuff. My boss tells a story about a former German ambassador that he knew of some country. It's not important which one, but he asked him about Taiwan, and he said, "What would it take for Germany to care about Taiwan's future?" And he said, "Well, I'm not going to pay any attention to Taiwan unless Taiwan has unless Siemens has a huge investment in Taiwan. That's going to focus my attention." So I do think that foreign direct investment matters at a strategic level, Mike. I do. And I would give you another sort of general anecdote on this as well. In respect to the supply chain, I think particularly in respect to chips, because Taiwan is such a hugely significant player in the production of chips that go into pretty much everything that we procure nowadays, other than what we eat, of course. As the foundry model, the foundry model is when you design a chip, but you have somebody else manufacture it because the cost of manufacturing is so high. There are only 3 or 4 companies in the world that can actually afford to build facilities now to manufacture chips, but you can't afford to do the R&D. And then you go to a company like Taiwan Semiconductor and they make it for you. Well, if the United States finds itself in a situation because of a conflict or an embargo in the Taiwan Strait and it can't get the chips it needs for its weapons, I'm pretty sure that's going to focus the president's mind. So I think that again there are trends here that are also significant when it comes to the economic development of Taiwan and what strategic investment looks like and how it can focus the minds of foreign countries in respect to Taiwan's future fortunes.
Perhaps we'll take one more question. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Julian Baum. I'm a journalist who was based in Taiwan for a long time. It seems like we're dodging the question a little bit of political risk and what the government is doing or perhaps not doing in terms of hedging those political risks. And the situation is obviously very complicated, but I'm thinking of an interview that President Ma gave to the Wall Street Journal just a few months after he was elected in 2008, in which he said in English, "We want to see the total integration of the economic and financial relations across the Taiwan Strait." And to me, that is sort of where they have deliberately been heading, despite all the other talk about a globalization strategy with trade relations and with other sort of lingering policies from the previous era, but it seems like the government has done very little in terms of hedging. In fact, it seems like they have maybe talked about it occasionally with some foreign businessmen or people that are concerned about the political risks, but in fact they are not doing much at all about hedging those risks. And I would just like to just come down a little more sort of acutely on this issue of the need for some hedging strategies and whether any of you see evidence of that from the current government.
Luke, please. Should I start this time, Peter?
Or whether it's even possible to have hedging
Well,
strategies.
I really agree with Peter's. One of the last points that Peter makes is that the Taiwan government is not pushing hard enough, and I think, Julian, you're driving at that as well. Is that there are opportunities out there, and the government is passive to some degree when it comes to pushing those interests, and the risk reward that comes with it. As I sort of look in my crystal ball, I'm not a therapist or anything like that, but maybe if I try and to be a therapist for a second, we look back at the very difficult period surrounding parts of Chen Shui-bian's rule and the atmospherics of when the Ma government took over. There was a strong focus by the Ma government, particularly in its relationship with the United States and China, but across the board, to be perceived as not rocking the boat, right? To be perceived as you know, we're not going to have, there'll be no surprises. I forget what his three things, but no surprises. The new ambassador actually reiterated them right when he was appointed. To have no surprises, and that what we see anyway, or what I see, is passivity, often on the part of the government, in a desire not to be perceived to rocking the boat. But what it ends up happening is that Taiwan not pushing hard enough for what it needs and what it wants. And I think we're seeing that at the moment. The China relationship is going well because the Chinese believe categorically that this is playing to their long-term interests. So they're happy to do it. As soon as it doesn't, or in their view, they'll stop doing it. So this is, from their standpoint, it's all working out just fine. But again, I agree with both of you. I think there's a great deal more pushing could be done. But there's a passivity there. Is that a word? Is it help me out. Passivity? Yeah, all right, there we go. I've got accents, so I can just chuck it out there and hopefully you'll agree. But this passivity within the government over pushing for its interests, perhaps as a consequence of the fact that they don't want to be viewed as troublemakers. And again, I think you might well see that playing out in respect to TPP or inclusion in TPP.
I think, just one word, or they say, okay, as far as I understand, no political party in Taiwan, including DDP and DSU, they don't want to antagonize. They don't want to antagonize China, all right. And it's nice to reduce the tension across the Taiwan Strait, all right. It's nice to reduce the tension, but it is necessary, as Rob said, that to hedge against the risk. To hedge against the risk, you cannot just look at the optimistic part and without taking the potential problems that involve, particularly until the sovereignty issue was resolved, which I don't know when or how. Right.
Sorry, can I just jump in just really quickly? Particularly, this issue of not pushing hard enough, I think, is particularly important because the Ma government, given the fact that it was bloodied at the beginning of this year when it pivoted and tried to do some domestic reform, has really backed off. And it's now its principal argument and the structure of its case for domestic reform, which would have the most dramatic impact on growth and fortunes, is inclusion in bilateral and multilateral global agreements. That's what they're hanging their hat on. So when you couple that with passivity, you're really, you're really putting your eggs in somebody else's basket, recognizing, of course, that Taiwan, we already accept that Taiwan has a very difficult time representing its own interests because of opposition from China. So, sorry, I'm just thinking more about your point. I think the point that you raise is extremely important.
Well, I guess what I was also saying that there's a political will issue here that could change with future administrations, but it seems to be, I mean, maybe the options for the room for maneuver is getting less and less.
That's right.
But it's still a political decision, ultimately, to do something. So.
And I don't think that Taiwan has all the time in the world. I think it's on the clock.
Are there any baskets left to put your eggs in?
Okay, well, with this, on that doom and gloom note, if you would all join me in thanking Alejandro, Rupert, and Peter for leading such a great discussion today. Thank you so much for coming.